So welcome colleagues if you are beginning to join us online, and welcome colleagues who are in International House in real life. I would be most delighted to be there myself, but unfortunately I don't feel well enough and I decided not to make it a super spreader because, as Danilo said, there are many worse things than losing your luggage, and the worst one would be that we would all be ill having attended this seminar today. So very much welcome to you, though, if you are joining us online or joining us in the space. My name is Marcia Meskimen. I'm the director of the Institute of Advanced Studies, and it's a great pleasure, actually, even at a distance, to open this seminar today. We are joined today by Danilo Rothberg, Professor of Sociology of Communication at Sao Paulo University, and he has been working for some time on the project that from which he's going to derive his talk today, PANCOPOP, with a colleague, led by a colleague of mine in Social Sciences and Humanities, Professor Sabina Mihelj. And I'm about to turn over to Sabina to do a broader introduction to PANCOPOP and what the topic is going to be. But as an IAS conversation, I think this is particularly timely. We are waiting, of course, at 3 p.m. today, GMT, for the 2024 Doomsday Clock announcement. I have it open on my machine to keep an eye on it today. And we ask ourselves questions like, can it possibly be closer than 90 seconds to midnight this year, as it has been announced in 2023? The Bulletin of Atomic Scientists will be looking at the interconnected phenomena in particular, and I do stress interconnected phenomena of climate change, nuclear weapon use, and of course, pandemic, and the question of how pandemics are managed or indeed mishandled, mismanaged globally. These three big factors are not natural threats. They are not natural existential issues. They are entirely political in many instances, and they have everything to do with how we organize and how we think about crisis, about how we think about our planet, how we think about how we live on it, how we think about how we manage and organize it. As Trump and Biden look set to enter into a rematch, the challenge of populism in politics, and particularly the role of the media and the critical role that the media will play in populist politics as we approach maybe fewer than 90 seconds to midnight will become kind of quite critical. So how do we face that, and what do we do about it? Well, we know more about it, we learn about it, we keep in communication, we have conversations. And this talk I am very much looking forward to as part of an ongoing project that Sabina, I'm sure, will introduce in a moment, but one that actually does help us to know more about it and to learn more, and to learn more at a cross-cultural and international level, which is very much the point, to open the conversations and the dialogues. So by the end of this talk, I am very much hoping that Danilo will have illuminated for us a range of perspectives that will enable us to know more and to move forward in the future as a much more informed and appropriately politicized community. Thank you so much, Danilo, for coming to the IAS, and very much welcome.
Well, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me as well. We're relying here on technology that can track me as well, so I hope you can hear and see me well. So I have the pleasure of introducing both the main speaker, Professor Danilo Rothberg, as well as telling you a little bit about the project that I'm leading that involves collaboration with Danilo, before handing over to Danilo to present the results of the strand of the project that he's leading. If Kieran, if you could turn to the next slide. The project that we're both part of and that I'm leading is called PANCOPOP, and it looks at the nature of pandemic communication during the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular at the influence of populism and populist leaders on the nature and dynamic of this communication. So here we have an overview of our team. There's 12 of us. Well, to be entirely precise, we have a 13th member now as well, spread across 4 different countries, in fact 5 sometimes or more, depending on where we are. The research is focused in 4 countries, US, Brazil, Poland, and Serbia. All of these 4 countries were led by populist leaders, at the very least at the start of the pandemic. Obviously, the situation has now changed in 3 of these 4 countries, where populist governments have been replaced. But the project was motivated by this realization that although we know quite a lot about the nature of emergency risk communication during health crises, and there is a lot of practical guidance as well for professionals who are involved in it, this guidance and the professionals themselves were taken over by surprise during this pandemic by the behavior of some political leaders, which has really derailed existing dynamics. And actually obstructed the capacity of professional communicators as well as media institutions to support effective health crisis communication. So our intention was really to address this gap in knowledge and better understand the impact of populist leaders and populism also more generally as a phenomenon on our ability to manage communicatively health crisis in an effective way. So we started, for instance, by considering what are the features of populism that might contribute to obstacles in health crisis coverage. And obviously the key thing here is the politicized and polarized coverage that turns or presents any type of problem as one that is consists of a confrontation between the people and the elites. So populist leaders might have a tendency to politicize the crisis rather than engage in or support people in coming together and different factions in coming together to overcome a crisis. So a very unusual situation, different from the situation we had in relation to prior health crisis, for instance, with the swine flu pandemic and similar. So we can move on to the next slide. So to investigate this dynamic, we decided to look at several different points in the pandemic communication cycle, as we called it. So we looked, started by looking at government-led crisis communication. So this is the aspect of communication that is very rarely looked at in our discipline. The dynamics between government communicators, public health authority communication, and journalists. So the kinds of behind the scenes almost communication that was happening at the time. We looked at media policies and the extent to which they were changed during the pandemic, or how existing policies were mobilized or not, whether they were effective at the time. We looked at the media coverage during the pandemic, which is a strand that Danilo is leading, and you will hear some results from that particular strand in a moment. We also looked at public attitudes, so the attitudes, both in terms of political attitudes and populist attitudes, as well as attitudes to different measures. And finally, although it's not mentioned there, we also had a strand looking at the geopolitics of pandemic communication, and in particular at the influence of Russia and China. So this is another strand that we are still working on at the minute. So if we can go to the next slide. I'll quickly talk you through each of the first a little bit more background just in terms of the coverage that will be relevant later to Danilo's talk. Oh yeah, but let's keep that one. So in terms of the strands, so the first strand, as I said, looked at health crisis communication. We mapped primarily government-led pandemic crisis communication processes in each of the countries. We looked at which actors were involved, how they reached decisions over how best to communicate, how to frame public health messages, what themes were dominant, and what was the relationship with the political and scientific actors. And this question in particular proved particularly important in terms of the relative influence of political over scientific actors in this dynamic, and obviously the role of polarization and partisanship in this context. Next slide, please. The media policies strand looked at the impact of populist leaders on media policies, their implementation as well as changes. We focused on several different strands here. Freedom of expression was very important, but also issues such as distribution of public advertising at the time and how it's changed. So just to give you a flavor, there was a lot of infringement of freedom of expression, and clearly populist leadership was involved in blocking public access to information as well, which created all sorts of problems also with public trust. If we go to the next slide. And in terms of media coverage, just very briefly, because you'll hear much more about this from Danilo, but this strand examined domestic media coverage of the pandemic in the 4 countries, and the implications it had for the quality of public deliberation. So we were using, as you'll see, frame analysis to see how the pandemic was actually framed, and what implications these frames had. How the frames related to the frames that were promoted by government communication. So did journalists frame the pandemic differently from the leadership, or in a similar way? Did they try and contest the framing that was coming from populist leaders in particular? And also looking at things such as how polarized or not, how conflict focused was the media coverage of the pandemic, or not, and how actually conflict became articulated in the coverage. Next slide. Oops, looking at strand 4, public attitudes. This involved looking obviously at patterns of both media use and information seeking, but also trust. So who did citizens actually trust when it came to health matters? Where did they turn to for trustworthy information? And also whether they were exposed to unreliable health information and misinformation, and to what extent they actually believed the virus conspiracy theories that were circulated at the time about the origins of the virus and about the different treatments, as well as the post-pandemic attitudes. Moving on to strand 5, pandemic geopolitics. The strand looked at, in particular, the extent to which the geopolitical activities of China and Russia impacted or were reflected both in domestic coverage and domestic communication. So in this context, we're looking, for instance, at debates over vaccines, the extent to which each of the countries adopted either Russian or Chinese vaccines, but also accepted, for instance, various forms of help from these countries. As well as, on the other hand, the extent to which there were worries in public debates in these 4 countries about the spread of disinformation or unwelcome political influence on what was happening domestically. So I think I'll stop at this point and hand over to Danilo. I think, Danilo, you might want to skip a few slides, to get to your point. So yeah, maybe just a few words more about Danilo's role. So Danilo Rothberg is leader of Strand 3. He's a professor, as Marta introduced, at one of the major universities in Brazil, in particular São Paulo state, which is also where one of our funders is based. And I'm very pleased to have Danilo visiting us again here as a crucial link for this project to the Brazilian component of our work. Danilo, over to you.
Okay, great. Good morning, good afternoon. It's great to see you, and thank you, Sabina, for the introduction. And I just want to thank also Professor Sabina and Marshall for having me once more, and the Institute of Advanced Studies having me as a visiting fellow once more. It's great to be here, and I want to present you briefly some results of the Strand 3, which won the strand I'm leading right now. We have just preliminary results because we are still working on it, right? But I think we have interesting findings, and so let me go through I just skipped some slides because that's so we used instead of strand 3 qualitative framing analysis. And we deployed to analyze 2,000 news stories. It was around 500 per country, and they were published in 2 in 12 different news sources, and like 3 sources per country between January 2020 to December 2022. And this sample was selected randomly from the larger corpus that was extracted using relevant keywords from the usual databases, and we used a constructed week. We took 1 month, 1 week for each month, right? Following the 36 months, that gives us around 150 weeks. And we went through 2 stages. The first one was coding of materials using a list of generic frames, which, well, I'm going to tell you about in a minute. And also we deployed an in-depth analysis of each frame with a focus on key facts and developments reported, and such things such as the actors involved, suggested for oil causes and solutions, and also differences and similarities between outlets and countries, but also between different political perspectives, considering that the nature of the corpus reveals a lot of how political ideology might have influenced the tone of the coverage, right? So, well, this is just another strand, but yeah. So, going straight to the results of strand 3, I would emphasize that these 5 generic frames were built from literature, right? So we just analyzed the previous literature and found out that not only the COVID coverage showed this 5 generic frames, but also in previous health emergencies, such as the H1N1 virus. So these 5 generic frames are the attribution of responsibility, the social economic consequences, science and technology, human interests, and the complex frame. And from these 5, the first 2 were kind of dominant or the most common in average between the 4 countries, right? There's slight differences between them. I will show you them in a minute. So, but this first aspect suggests that information about solutions to the crisis maybe have been overshadowed by the coverage that brought to the front the attribution of responsibility, human interest, and conflict, and often focused on electoral disputes and disagreements over preventative strategies. I will go deeper into this in a minute, but let me say that it was a kind of not really a surprise, but we kind of expected the the fight between political sectors to become to the front of the news coverage, because that would follow the usual news-making criteria for journalists, which is bringing the conflict to the fore, because that sells more newspapers and papers to a general audience. But also we found that as you can see here, the attribution of responsibility was by far the most dominant frame. I have to say that as a qualitative analysis, these numbers should be looked in a careful way, because we do have the intercaller reliability for that, but we are just stressing the qualitative results, right? But we still are approaching these numbers to say what we can interpret from that. But we can see that the social economic consequences are the second most dominant frame in Brazil, Serbia, and Poland, but not in the US, right? Where it's the first one. I will come back to this in a while, but let me go through the next slide. So we also found significant differences in the stance to populist leaders, and that those emerged between outlets and across countries. First one is related to Poland and Serbia, where we noted that many state-controlled public service media praised the populist leader and also state authorities. And the main aspect of this news coverage was that official positions and argument were praised, and at the same time, the opposition was blamed for generating discord, while critical reporting was very limited to opposition as in relatively rare. Despite this dominant aspect, we can tell that there were good examples of good reporting. We are still getting into detail of those, but we can say that not everything was lost. And also in Brazil, we noted that public service media also conveyed official positions. However, it did it less emphatically so than in Poland and Serbia, while commercial outlets were very critical of Bolsonaro as a kind of maybe a national consensus against the president, the populist leader. And in the US, on the other hand, we found that Fox framed Trump positively, while New York Times and the USA Today were very critical. And of course, that we know that these differences are linked to differences in how populist approaches to the dynamic and the unique extent of populist control over media. Particularly the populist control over media is something that we're exploring more, and we always have a hypothesis that the more populist control over the media, more aligned with government the media will be, but that's not a surprise. It could be expected, of course, but how it was covered, that's something that we're still approaching. So that's a general conclusion, and also it's not really surprising given the usual newsmaking criteria for commercial newspapers, but we still think that something to be representative of the whole research, because we found that the pandemic was politicized in very disturbing ways, right? So which ways? In common, in the four countries we analyzed with more frequently in Brazil and the United States, we can see that the public debate fueled by news framing about how to deal with the crisis was obscured by electoral disputes and clashes between strategies, and such strategies often were anchored in science denial and disbelief in public health authorities. So solutions were clouded by conflict and the blame game, right? The newspapers were trying to blame the government, or the government in turn could be shielded from criticism in countries where the media control was stronger enough to silence the opposition. That would be the case of mainly Serbia and Poland, but not in Brazil and the US, where we can find more media diversity and the opposition was more noisy or more dominant in the coverage, in the sense that the attribution of responsibility frame was characterized by the presence of harsh criticism against the government. Yeah. So we also noted that in Brazil, the conflict frame extended beyond political elites, and that happened encouraging disagreements between ordinary people. Ordinary people advocating for vaccines and Bolsonaro supporters. So there's a huge distance between Bolsonaro on the one hand, and all the others on the other hand, right? So, and in a way, like it's on the screen that this frame may have played a significant role in shaping a contribution to shape the Brazilian political climate, because the pandemic was discovered as another stage for a pre-existing political battle. But again, it's not really surprising outcome, but in the way that it happened is very, very interesting. That was the case in Brazil, despite Bolsonaro's and Trump's accusations against China. The Brazilian coverage did not align with that of populist leaders. And China, in Brazil at least, was not blamed for the emergence of the pandemic. The fractures between federal government and states were very frequent in Brazil in both most dominant frames, which were the attribution of responsibility and social economic consequences frame. And in the US, those fractures also came to the fore. However, governors in the US were not represented under the attribution of responsibility frame and so resilient as the lack of federal coordination would have left them confused, according to the New York Times, for instance. But such newspaper at the same time condemned Chinese authorities for concealing information about COVID-19. And that was something interesting because we noted that the conservative Fox News repeatedly assigned responsibility for the spread of the coronavirus to China. However, the centrist USA Today ruled that Trump's stance attributing the spread of the virus to the Chinese had a stigmatizing effect and would have helped to reinforce the prejudice against China. But then we found different positions in Poland and Serbia. And in Poland, for instance, under the attribution of responsibility frame, the Chinese government was heavily criticized for allegedly blocking information in the initial phase of the pandemic, and there is a similarity with the US. And we found the construction of such frame in a very kind of didactic way, because it brought the statistics, descriptions of how state institutions worked and how they were managing the crisis, and in Poland in the context of European Union's membership, or how Poland was coping in light of the other European members and other countries. But then in Serbia, that was an interesting finding. The anti-government daily Danas used attribution of responsibility frames when it reported on people wronged by the government's alleged inaction, and also investigating what the relevant institutions were going to face the crisis. But then in Serbia, the conflict frame is also characterized by the presence of stories about different tactics of political actors in using the pandemic as a part of their electoral strategies. That was a very marked characteristic of the conflict frame. The populist government was framed as if it were weaponizing, right, the pandemic to benefit electoral changes. Yeah. Well, this is something to be explored further in the next few weeks. I'm just bringing, as I said, preliminary results that we just got it from the last week of work. But yeah, we noted that public service media was captured in general by populist leaders in Brazil, Poland, and Serbia. And we can explain that noting that the weakness of the public service media governance and accountability mechanisms in these countries would have facilitated its subordination under the government. Because in all these three countries, the public service structure was placed at the service of populist leaders, right? Yeah. But in Brazil, the compliance, let's say, with the government by public service media was revealed through the absence of criticism against the government. While in Serbia and Poland, there was more a different attitude, because we know that this strong moral judgment underlying frames that blame the president as the responsible for the mismanagement of the pandemic in the commercial right-wing media in Brazil, but not in the public service media. So just favoring the government by silencing the opposition, but not explicitly praising the government. An explicit praise to the government was found in Poland, where public service media acted as almost an official spokesperson. You can see these excerpts here from the president quoted by the newspaper. And he said, well, I highly appreciate the actions taken in this manner. I'm very grateful for public services. It's almost an official voice. And but also in Serbia, positive overall assessments were found. It's a very explicit praise to the government. So the frame analysis of public service media reveals that there was a kind of consensus between the discourses of populist leaders and those disseminated by public service media. So they opted for frames without or with less critical tone. And well, I guess approaching the last or so 5 minutes, just getting into the conclusion, so we have time for conversation if you wish. So in general, tabloids in Brazil, sorry, not in Brazil, but in Serbia and Poland, explore the pandemic within the scope of their usual editorial lines. However, and this was a kind of surprise, the tabloids sought a balance probably between sensationalism and the need for objective information, because they sensed that there is an urgency of providing guidance for dealing with the pandemic, so they wanted to make this balance. But not only because of that, but also we are making or trying to speculate that maybe this balance between objectivity and sensationalism in the tabloid in Serbia and Poland were due to the need of praising the government. Because in Serbia and Poland, we think that the government was trying to do the right thing and or dealing with the pandemic in a very seriously. So newspapers aligned with the government would provide objectivity and proper information about medical guidance against the pandemic. So as newspapers wanted to follow the government, they provided fine information for medical guidance against COVID. While quality papers in all the 4 countries preferred political frames. And well, of course, that it is not new, but we're going to get into details soon, because the tendency towards more left or right-leaning coverage was sustained throughout the pandemic. And well, of course, that this meant In the United States, the coverage of the New York Times adopted more critical frames of Trump, which were, of course, not as present on Fox News. And in the European countries, newspapers critical of the government maintained that line throughout the pandemic. Yeah, two final observations then. One regards the actors, how the main actors, or I mean, who the main actors were and how were they framed. Again, we are going to that, but we noted that the World Health Organization was positively portrayed and was generally framed under the attribution of responsibility and also science and technology frames in a way that was favorable to the organization in Brazil, Poland, and Serbia. And there, the organization was portrayed as a credible source in the fight against the virus, but not in the US, where the World Health Organization was framed in a very negative way by Fox News, which accused Biden of transferring the control over the lives of American citizens to the organization. And the last aspect I want to present is that yeah, we found good journalism practices, especially in the coverage of New York Times in the US, in the O Estado de São Paulo newspaper in Brazil, Atenas in Serbia, and the Gazeta in Poland, but then only in the other science and technology frames. We would have expected, or we would have preferred that the science and technology frame would be more present, because they mean solutions or ways to fight the virus, but they were not so present. So that's a kind of a problem that we noted. But these good journalism practices were visible in the way that they sought to explore subjects as vaccine development in a broad scientific context. They debunk fake news consistently and also provide detailed explanations of scientific issues that were cause of public uncertainty, such as the requirements of the vaccine approval, the impact of COVID on children in the US, and very practical advice in Poland and Serbia. I guess that there might be some more friends, but I just, yeah, that's the end. And we have my email and the project website, and just let me thank you for your kindness in being here today, and Sabina and Professor Masha for having me once more. Yeah.